Hi there everybody, welcome to Organisational Behaviour BUZZY 1029. In this lecture recording we're going to talk about decision making. By the end of the session you should hopefully be able to differentiate between prescriptive and descriptive models of decision making. Think about how groups and organisations make decisions in practice, and start to be able to point to some of the organisational factors which contribute to bad decisions, and we're going to pay particular attention to the garbage can model. The core reading for this is Huczynski and Buchanan, chapter 22 in the 2nd edition and chapter 20 in the 9th edition. Okay, let's get straight into it. So, decision making. Broadly speaking, decision making is a process which involves making a choice amongst different options. There's, broadly speaking, two different ways that people think about decisions or decision making. There are prescriptive models, which are more based on the idea of telling people how they should make decisions. And these tend to assume rationality. They tend to assume what we're going to call a maximising approach, which relies on clear agreement of goals, clear decision-making rules, a clear role structure, so on and so forth. Then there are descriptive models, descriptive models. It's been a long day, guys. Descriptive models which attempt to explain how individuals actually make decisions inside organisations. Descriptive models tend to emphasise that few actors have perfect rationality. There tends to be limits or bounds to their rationality, and that in most organisational contexts, actors don't try to maximise the outcome, they tend to satisfice, which means they tend to look for options which are good enough. And typically, in many organisational settings, there's actually unclear or ambiguous goals, incomplete rules and processes, leaving individuals a lot of discretion. So let's look at a few examples of each of these ways of modelling decisions. Prescriptive theory. A really great example of prescriptive theory would be the kinds of decision-making manuals and policies in the military. Something like MDMP, the military decision-making process, which the American military follows, is a set protocol of steps that help people to make decisions. And what they do is they all structure decisions so that they look the same. At their heart, many prescriptive models assume a rational model of decision making. And this works in a series of steps, almost like a computer program. So first, an organisation or people in an organisation have to recognise and define a problem or an opportunity. Then, according to rational decision-making models, they'll look for alternatives which will either solve the problem or exploit the opportunity. They'll gather information about those alternatives, evaluate them, and then select the correct alternative and either solve the problem or capture the opportunity. This rational model of decision-making is enormously powerful, and it definitely describes some of the processes through which people make decisions. However, it also leaves a number of questions. For example, where do problems or opportunities come from? How do people search for alternatives, and when do they stop searching for alternatives? How much information do they have? What kind of evaluative criteria are they going to apply to that information in order to select and implement their chosen course of action? So while this model tells us a lot, it is quite limited. We can build on this understanding though and think about different types of decisions. Instead of thinking that every decision has to be the same, we can start to see that there are different types of decisions. And one of the key distinctions here is between routine decisions and innovative or one-off decisions. Routine decisions are those which typically are well organised. That means they tend to be structured. There tends to be policies and processes in place. There tends to be clear goals, clear expectations. Innovative or unexpected decisions are the opposite. They tend to be unstructured problems where it's not clear what's going on, what the outcomes might be, what the solutions might be. they tend to have very vague goals, a high degree of uncertainty, a high level of risk, and the decision-making process can often be slow, even though the decision itself might really require a very quick decision. So, like a routine decision would be whether or not to send an email. If there's a policy in an organisation that you have to respond to an email within 2 hours, well, that's a routine decision. You don't have to think it through. You've just got to think, have I responded to this email or not? If not, I'll respond to it. An innovative decision, though, might be how to respond to an email that's asked a question that you have never, ever thought of before. Just in my recent experience at the university, I've had a number of students asking me about new policies related to COVID, which are really outside my area of expertise, to the point where not only do I not know the answer to the questions myself, but I don't even know who to ask for the answers to the questions myself. So these take a lot more thinking through. The questions are a lot more unstructured, and it's a much harder, less rational problem. Another way of thinking about the different types of decisions that people face in organisations is to think about the level of uncertainty. We talked about risk and uncertainty and complexity when we talked about environments, and we can use some of those ideas to define different types of decisions. So we can think about decision making which is done within high degrees of certainty, where there's stable equilibriums, or simple and stable, to use the Duncan and Emery and Trist sorts of language, simple and stable environments. And what this means is outcomes are known, alternatives are known, what's going to happen is very predictable. An example would be whether or not to open a fixed interest mortgage. You know exactly what you're going to be doing. Then you can have simple but dynamic environments where there's bounded instability. What does this mean? Well, again, if you think back to some of the different typologies of environments which we've covered, the Emery, Trist and Duncan typologies, they tell us that as an environment starts to become more dynamic, as it starts to change more, there's a greater degree of uncertainty in those environments. Uncertainty is the same as risk. If you're not certain what's going to happen, there is a risk that you might pick the wrong outcome. So in these types of decisions, when you have bounded instability, often decision makers are aware of the alternatives, but not really the outcomes. So an example would be trying to predict the weather. You know it's either going to be sunny, snowing, raining, cloudy. It's going to be hot or cold, but you're not 100% certain what's going to happen. And then you have complete uncertainty, what we might call complex dynamic environments. In Huxington and Buchanan, they call this explosive instability. Here, alternatives are poorly understood. Let's put that poorly understood. The outcomes of the alternatives are difficult to trace, and it makes it incredibly difficult to make decisions with any degree of certainty. And an example here would be developing a radically innovative new product for which there's no known competitors or established market. Vroom and Yeton, 73, took this idea that we can start to divide different types of decisions and match different types of decision-making styles. They took this idea forward. So this is an example of what we talked about in our leadership lectures of contingency approaches. So the idea is there's no longer a one model for all decisions, but Vroom and Yeton suggested we can recognise differences in decisions which can help us decide what kind of decision-making process is most appropriate. So they tell us the effectiveness of a decision is dependent on the quality. Does it achieve its aim? Is it acceptable for everybody that's involved? Have people bought into the decision? And how much time and resources have been available to reach the decision? And we won't go through all of these, but they suggest that there are very distinct types of decision-making style which are appropriate for particular situations. So we have autocratic styles of decision-making, where the leader is supposed to obtain all the necessary information, or have to hand all of the necessary information, either because they are the leader or because they are fed that information from their subordinates. And the leader makes decisions. They may explain them to the subordinates, but really that's not the point. In an autocratic decision, you need the leader to make a clear, quick decision and just tell people what's been decided. You can go to the other extreme and think about delegation decisions, where the leader, instead of taking information from their subordinates, will supply people lower down with information and let them make the correct decisions, trust their subordinates. If we think back to our discussions of leadership, we talked about transformational leaders and participative leaders. We talked about democratic decision making, and this is really what we're talking about here. So Vroom and Yeton develop a model which suggests in particular circumstances certain styles of decision making are most appropriate. So you can ask yourself the question, is there a need to try to find the best possible solution? If not, well then you might want to go to the next question, acceptance. Is acceptance by subordinates critical to implementing the solution? If not, well, you could pick A1. Right? You could go with an autocratic style of decision making. And why is that? Well, because if the leader gets the wrong decision because of their personal flaws or biases, it doesn't really matter. And if people don't like the decision, it doesn't really matter because you've said it doesn't matter. Subordinates aren't critical to implementing the decision. So you see how this presents a model which decision makers can work through to think, well, what is going to be the most appropriate decision for their context. There are limitations to rational decision-making models, and organisational studies, organisational history in particular, is littered with examples of organisations seemingly pursuing rational decisions but making incredibly irrational decisions. The Ford Pinto case is a great example. In the Ford Pinto case, Ford executives were found to have minuted a meeting in which they sat around and put a dollar figure on the number of deaths that were likely to happen due to a product flaw in the Ford Pinto, which was a car. And then they calculated what the likely cost of recalling the cars and the trucks would be, what it would cost to fix them, and made a decision, a rational decision seemingly, that it was better to leave these unsafe vehicles on the road and just pay compensation to anybody who had, well, to the family of anybody who had died, rather than recall the cars. Now, on the surface, this is a rational decision. They've evaluated the alternatives, they had a clear decision-making criteria, they wanted to save costs. But from an ethical standpoint, we might question whether it was a good decision. And this leads us to descriptive models of, let me just fix that, descriptive models of decision making. Descriptive models are based on a very simple insight, which is, while prescriptive models look good on paper, when you go into organisations, often organisations don't follow those prescriptions, they don't follow those kinds of models, and even when they try to, they often go wrong in reality. So this slide here is an example of the US military's attempts to map out the Iraq War to try to understand what kinds of threats and problems they were going to face. And as you can see, it becomes an incredibly confusing slide, which actually makes it almost impossible to understand what's going on rather than simplifying things. So descriptive theorists like Herbert Simon spend more time going into organisations and actually trying to study what goes on. And one of the key findings that they all agree on is that in most organisations, rationality is bounded, it's limited. So individuals act rationally but within certain limits and certain contexts. The executives in the Ford Pinto case had their rationality bounded in terms of trying to minimise costs, and what they did was a rational decision only in terms of minimising costs. The likes of Herbert Simon say this is what happens in all organisations. Once an organisation has a goal, that limits the rationality. No longer are actors in organisations trying to be perfectly rational. They're not trying to maximise in a kind of economic model. They're just trying to achieve that goal. And this means, in some instances, individuals are unable to act truly rationally. Based on this idea, behavioural scientists have started to analyse what they call the biases and heuristics, which limit people's cognitive processes, limit people's ability to make decisions. So let's look at some of these ideas in a little bit more depth. Herbert Simon argued that if we accept people in organisations aren't rational, that they're not trying to satisfy or maximise, they're not trying to maximise their decisions, their outcomes. Well, what are they trying to do? And he came up with the idea of satisficing. He said that in most organisational settings, people tend to settle on one of the earliest solutions that seems to be good enough. So rather than trying to search through all the alternatives to find the best outcome, because making a decision is better than procrastinating, because time can be limited, because there can be advantages to first movers, and because most organisations bound rationality, not in terms of the best outcome, but in terms of specific goals, people in organisations, when making decisions, tend to satisfice. They look for the option that's good enough rather than evaluate all of the alternatives. And when they're trying to evaluate alternatives, it turns out they are incredibly influenced by biases and heuristics. So biases are prejudices and systematic distortions which shape how people evaluate even factual numerical data. And heuristics are simple rules or strategies, shortcuts that people apply. So, I know that if I do this, this will happen. Often these are learned by experience and not backed up by any sort of hard scientific facts. The work of Tversky and Kahneman has been pivotal in understanding the role of biases and heuristics, and they have a whole series of papers and experiments illustrating how people's ability to process information and make decisions can be manipulated. One example of this is their work on anchoring. In a 1974 study, they asked two groups of college students, two questions. The first was, is the number of African countries in the UN higher or lower than? And then to one group they said 28%. In another group they said like 100%. The next question was, how many African countries are in the UN? And what they found was the people that were told the lower number in the first question almost always tended to underestimate the number of African countries in the UN. The people in the group that was supplied with a higher number for the first question tended to overestimate. Tversky and Kahneman said what's going on here is people are anchoring their evaluation in terms of the information that they were given in the first question, even though that information is not relevant at all. And this is one of the biases or heuristics that we know tends to colour and influence people's decision making. People tend to anchor their decisions often on irrelevant information that's just presented in at a similar time. Kahneman and Tversky later explored how contrasts can create biases, and in another study they presented different groups with essentially the same outcomes but framed in a different way. So in one framing that was positive, the outcome talked about saving lives, and in a negative framing the outcome was presented as killing people. And even though technically, sort of mathematically, if any of you that in your accounting classes go on to do net present value or any of those kinds of calculations, you'll realise the options on this slide are the same mathematically in terms of probabilities, but the framing is different. And again, Kahneman and Tversky found that when you present an option favourably in terms of saving lives, more people choose that option. So in this experiment they said you can choose either the first treatment or the second treatment, the positive or the negative. People almost always gravitate towards the positive. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the way you present information to people, the way you present options, can be incredibly influential in determining which option they pick. Another good example of biases and heuristics is Shaw's work on the escalation of commitment. Behavioural scientists and economists sometimes call this the sunk cost fallacy. So the escalation of commitment is, once somebody has selected an outcome, particularly organisations, they tend to become incredibly committed to that outcome. And even when the decision that they've made starts to produce negative outcomes, people very rarely abandon it and change. What they tend to do is become overly invested and overly committed to the bad decision. You know, they double down, a bit like the gambler chasing his losses. The escalation of commitment is an example where people become so committed to the decision that they've made, even though new evidence shows them it was a bad decision. They don't think it was the decision, they think it was the execution. They become even more committed to it. You might want to think about recent events around the world as a way of explaining, or think about this to explain recent events around the world. And the sunk cost fallacy is simply that it's very easy for people to focus on sunk costs, but as economists say, sunk costs are sunk costs. If you have invested money that you can't get back, you shouldn't really consider that when making a decision. But people often do. People will often think, you know, if I've already invested £10,000 in this project but it's not worked, and they've come back to me and said that they need another 5,000, well, rather than lose the 10, I might as well invest the extra 5. This is an escalation of commitment. This is the sunk cost fallacy. It's letting a decision in the past influence a decision in the future. Okay, so we've had a look at prescriptive and descriptive decision-making models. Now let's talk a little bit about how groups interact in decisions. When we talked about group structure and group formations, we've talked about some of the benefits of group working and some of the potential pitfalls. We can now think about this specifically in terms of decision-making. We know there are some benefits to putting people into groups to make decisions, but there are some costs. When people enter into groups, one of the things which can happen is they can start to shift risk. That is, some groups and some people when they enter groups can be more willing to accept risky decisions because they are no longer personally accountable for those decisions. It's now the group's decision. So when you make something a group decision, it is no longer just the individuals who are accountable for it, but the group who is accountable. So this can lead some individuals and some groups to engage in what's called risk shift, where they become more willing to take risks. In other examples, groups can engage in what's called caution shift, which is the opposite, where the individuals in the group who might be more willing to take risks get talked out of it by more cautious members of the group. Whichever outcome occurs tends to be a factor of the makeup of the group, the formation of the group, the kinds of dominant characters that take over the group. Where are we? Where's the slide I was looking for? There it is. Janis, in 1982, developed the concept of groupthink to really try to explain some of these processes. Janis argued that when people start making decisions as a group, what tends to happen is they tend to become very committed, overly committed to their decisions. And he coined the term groupthink to suggest that what can happen is inside the group, as they start making decisions, they start they create like a self-fulfilling prophecy where they're supporting each other's biases and heuristics rather than questioning them. This creates groupthink, which in turn can create either risk shift or caution shift. So groups can engage in a whole series of behaviours which make them more likely to make poor decisions. For example, groups can start to exert pressure on each other, whether that's direct pressure like shouting at somebody if they don't agree with you, or threatening people so that they keep silent. And this can give groups an illusion of unanimity, to think that everybody is agreeing just because the most vocal members of the group agree on a decision. Groups also tend to support each other, so they rationalise their decisions. They think that this is the only course of action. They talk themselves into a position where they think the decision that they've chosen is the only sensible one that anybody could consider. And Janis taught us this groupthink, and it leads groups to either accept more risk or less risk than they probably should. Now, despite these negatives, there are some benefits of putting people into groups when making decisions. It means there's a greater pool of knowledge. You can have different perspectives, which can actually minimise groupthink and can minimise risk shift and caution shift. There can be greater comprehension of the problems, particularly complex problems. Groups can be a training ground where you can scenario plan, you can think through issues, you can start to test issues. And if you can sell a decision to the group, if you can get acceptance from the group that's made that decision, in spite of the different perspectives and knowledge in the group, well, then it's more likely that there'll be wider buy-in from the organisation. So a lot of this depends on how cohesive the group is. If the group is small, like a very small leadership team that have been together for a very long time, tend to perceive outsiders as threats, they tend to be quite isolated, well, this will tend to produce more groupthink because there's fewer perspectives, there's less knowledge, it's less a testing ground for acceptance. So groups can have some real advantages, but they can have some real disadvantages. Good examples of group decision making gone awry, again, there's many of them in organisation studies. A nice example which you can look into in a recent Netflix documentary is the Challenger spacecraft disaster. Challenger was a spacecraft that was highly calibrated by some of the best scientists in the world. But it turned out, behind the scenes, different teams were engaged in different types of politics, have their own bounded rationality, started satisficing, and developed a sense of groupthink where they didn't listen to caution from some outside, what were perceived as outsiders, and it led to a spacecraft to explode. And I strongly recommend that documentary if you get the chance. So, we've looked at prescriptive and descriptive models, we've thought about groups and how they make decisions and some of the positives and negatives. Now let's think a little bit about, in more depth, about bad decisions. Cohen, March and Olson in 1972 coined the idea of the garbage can model. This is a really influential way of thinking in organisation studies. What Cohen, March and Olson suggested is, too often we think about organisations when they make decisions as if the organisation was one thing, or that there were just groups within the organisation, each of whom are trying to satisfy or have bounded rationalities. They suggested that we think about organisations not in terms of people or groups, but in terms of decisions themselves. So they suggested that we can picture organisations as a sort of pool or a garbage can of problems and solutions. And they argued that in many organisations there are solutions floating about looking for problems. So you see how this turns around the rational model of decision making. Instead of it starting with a problem, now the decision starts with the solution. So they argued that in many organisations people will have their pet projects, they'll have their biases, they'll have their personal projects that they are pushing, and they'll be looking constantly for problems to link their solutions to. So if we start from the idea that organisations are a collection of solutions, then we have to think, well, where do the problems come from? And Cohen, March and Olson said problems do enter organisations, and that what actually happens, according to them, in decision making is a problem comes into an organisation, and within the organisation there's a limited pool of solutions, but rather than evaluate them in a rational sense, it tends to be the first one that gets attached to the problem, frames it. So a solution very quickly latches onto a problem, frames that problem in terms of its solution, and pushes for it. So a good example from recent memory for me would be in the wake of the pandemic, many universities started to push digital learning. Now it turns out digital learning has been on the agenda at universities, well, for as long as I've been an academic, which is over a decade. But it's always been a solution which hasn't really had a problem because we haven't needed it, because we've had better, or maybe not better, but more established ways of working in terms of face-to-face teaching, lectures and seminars. We've got all these buildings and libraries. So although we've had the solution, we've had a solution in digital learning technologies, that solution hasn't had a problem. And then what happened? When COVID hit, there was all of a sudden a problem for this solution. And many of us working in universities very quickly found that we were encouraged to use digital technologies more and more to support students. So it seemed like this solution had found the perfect problem. But then what happened, many universities, is it turned out the solution wasn't very good. And they had to reject that solution and start to go back to supporting more face-to-face teaching. And the reason for that was, or one reason for that maybe, let's say, that as people started to use digital technologies, universities realised how much it cost to run them, how difficult it is to develop materials, and they realised that actually it wasn't a cheap way of delivering materials at all. It's a really expensive way of teaching. So it turned out the solution that people thought it was, once it had a problem, it wasn't. And then the organisation started to look for new problems. So the garbage can models, I think it's a very useful and very accurate model for many organisational decisions. But it tells us that organisations can often make bad decisions, not because they're trying to make bad decisions, but simply because they don't take the time to engage in more rational decision making, because they're too easily influenced by, like I say, those pet projects, those solutions that are already established and floating around. Okie doke, so that sort of brings us to the end of this lecture. We've described prescriptive and descriptive models of decision making, thought about how groups and organisations make decisions, and then just in closing, thought about the garbage can model as a way of helping to explain where bad decisions might come from in organisations. As ever, if you've got any questions, please feel free to post it on the discussion forums or drop in to the Q&A Ask Me Anything lecture engagement sessions.